There is a Zen technique so powerful and dangerous that Hakuin, one of history's greatest masters, taught it only to the most prepared disciples, fearing it would be misunderstood and used by the ego mind to create more illusions rather than dissolve them. For centuries, this practice remained hidden in Japanese monasteries, passed down in whispers from master to disciple, because it not only awakens your dormant soul, it literally kills who you think you are so that who you truly are can finally breathe. Today, you will discover why this technique was silenced, how it works neurobiologically, and most importantly, how to apply it safely to awaken your true self without the dangers the ancient masters feared. The brutal truth our performative society doesn't want you to understand is that we live like exhausted actors playing false versions of ourselves, completely disconnected from our deepest essence. Each day we wake up and don social, professional, family, and spiritual masks, believing these temporary personas are our true identity. But there's a you behind all these performances, an authentic self that never needed to prove itself, defend itself, or justify itself to exist. And the technique I'm going to reveal today is the most direct path to finding this naked soul, stripped of all the fantasies we've constructed about who we should be. Welcome to Axiom Sage, where we delve into the depths of Zen wisdom to awaken what has always been there, patiently waiting for you to stop searching outside for what can only be found within. I am your guide on this perilous and liberating journey through Hakuin's Forbidden Technique, and in the next 60 minutes, you will not only understand why you constantly feel like an outsider in your own life, but you will also discover the exact method Zen masters use to die psychologically and be reborn spiritually, without drama, without unnecessary suffering, simply with the natural elegance of a leaf falling from the tree when its time comes. This isn't just another lecture on meditation or mindfulness. It's a surgical operation on the soul, using the sharpest blade of Zen awareness to cut through decades of conditioning, false identification, and spiritual seeking that has become just another ego performance. Prepare to discover that the awakening you so desperately seek doesn't happen by adding more practices, techniques, or knowledge to your life. It happens by removing everything that isn't essentially you, until only the radiant simplicity of your original nature remains. Have you ever woken up in the morning looking in the mirror, and for a moment didn't recognize the person staring back at you? I'm not talking about physical appearance, but that strange feeling of disconnection, as if you were an actor who'd forgotten what role you're playing today. This modern fragmentation that makes us live performing false versions of ourselves, completely disconnected from our deepest essence, isn't just a psychological malaise. It's the clearest symptom that our soul is asleep while our ego personality runs the show of life. Millions of people walk the world like spiritual zombies, functioning perfectly on the surface but feeling an abysmal void inside, because they've lost touch with who they truly are beneath all the masks they wear daily. The technique I'm going to reveal today has been deliberately silenced by Zen masters for centuries, because Hakuin and his successors understood something our Instagram spirituality completely ignores. True spiritual awakening is not a beautiful, inspiring, and shareable experience. It's a process of psychological death that can be absolutely terrifying for unprepared egos, and when misapplied, can generate more confusion and suffering instead of liberation. That's why this practice was taught only to the most prepared disciples, those who had already developed enough stability to avoid getting lost in the process of dissolving false identities. But today you'll discover how to apply this wisdom safely, using protocols the ancient masters developed to ensure that ego death results in authentic rebirth, not psychological chaos. And here's the paradox that will sound completely countercultural to modern minds addicted to constant growth and evolution. To find who you truly are, you must first die to who you think you are, as Dogen taught in his most profound writings. This is no poetic metaphor. It's a literal description of the neurological process that occurs when consciousness stops identifying with temporary thoughts, emotions, and personal stories and recognizes its original nature. But our spiritual culture has transformed even awakening into yet another ego achievement, yet another self-improvement project, yet another sophisticated form of social performance. People collect retreats, meditations, insights, and mystical experiences like trophies that prove how evolved they have become, without realizing that this desperate quest for awakening has become just another mask the ego uses to feel special and superior. The difference between authentic spirituality and performative spirituality is stark and needs to be exposed today. Real spirituality is characterized by increasing simplicity, less need to prove something or stand out, and more ability to be present with what is without needing to improve, fix, or transcend. Performative spirituality is obsessed with measurable progress, extraordinary experiences, technical language that impresses others, constant comparisons, and an underlying feeling of not quite there yet. If you identify with this second description, don't judge yourself. Practically all of us start this way because our culture teaches us no other way to approach the sacred. But there's a profound connection between this modern inner chaos and ancient teachings that few know about. Zheng, the third patriarch of Zen, wrote about the nature of the unborn mind in Xin Ming, the understanding that our essential consciousness was never born, never died, never affected by any of the temporary experiences we think define us. This wisdom has become more relevant than ever in our age of digital overload, where we are bombarded by thousands of daily stimuli that make us completely forget this immutable dimension of our being. Your smartphone may have disconnected you from your essence, but that same essence remains intact, patiently waiting for you to stop searching outside for what has never ceased to be within. I need to expose one of the most dangerous illusions of modern spirituality before teaching the technique that can truly set you free. Because if you don't understand this trap, you can spend decades accumulating spiritual experiences without ever touching your true nature. The modern addiction to insight collection has transformed the spiritual path into yet another ego project, where we accumulate knowledge, techniques, experiences, and revelations as trophies that prove our evolution, without ever allowing the true transformation that completely dissolves the need to prove anything to anyone, including ourselves. It's like someone who collects detailed maps of exotic territories but never leaves home to truly travel. They possess abundant information about spiritual destinations, yet remain exactly where they've always been in terms of inner fulfillment. The neurosis of constant pursuit that characterizes our era reveals something disturbing. Our anxious mind can transform even meditation, contemplation, and spiritual practice into yet another task to be achieved, yet another goal to be reached, yet another area where we need to improve and optimize our performance. Have you ever noticed how even sitting in silence can become a mental race where you constantly evaluate whether you're meditating well, whether you should be more relaxed, or whether other practitioners are progressing faster than you? This competitive mindset contaminates the very practice that should dissolve the separation between self and others, between success and failure, between progress and stagnation. And herein lies the fatal error that keeps millions of seekers trapped in endless cycles of spiritual frustration, the seduction of instant awakenings promised by a culture addicted to quick results. Our immediate gratification society has even managed to contaminate our understanding of the time required for genuine inner alchemy. People want to hack enlightenment with 10-minute breathing techniques, achieve samadhi through meditation apps, or awaken their kundalini in weekend workshops. But Hakuin spent decades developing his technique, going through profound crises, moments of total ego dissolution, periods where he couldn't distinguish between reality and hallucination, until he finally developed a safe method to guide others through this radical transformation. The subtle signs that you're spiritually performing rather than truly transforming are more common than we realize, but they're rarely discussed with brutal honesty. Do you feel compelled to share every spiritual insight or experience you've had? Do you secretly compare your progress to that of other practitioners? Do you get irritated when less evolved people don't grasp spiritual concepts you've mastered? Do you feel a subtle need to be recognized as awake or conscious? These are all unconscious mechanisms through which the ego co-opts the spiritual journey to strengthen itself rather than dissolve it. There's no judgment in this. It's almost inevitable that we'll go through this phase, but recognizing these patterns is essential to transcending them. Zhuangzi's metaphor of the hollow bamboo to describe the enlightened sage is revolutionary when deeply understood. The bamboo is useful not because of what it contains, but because of what it does not contain. The empty space at its center that allows water, sound, and wind to flow through it unhindered. Likewise, True awakening does not happen by filling the mind with more concepts, experiences, and spiritual knowledge, but by completely emptying it of everything inessential, until only the pure capacity to be present with what is remains, without agenda, without project, without need to improve or transcend anything. This requires a courage few possess. The courage to discover who you are when you are not trying to become anyone. If you recognize yourself in this description of false spiritual awakening, don't despair. In fact, this recognition is the first real step toward authentic freedom. Most people never even realize they're trapped in this trap. So your awareness of these patterns is already a sign that your soul is beginning to awaken from spiritual hypnosis. And Hakwin's Forbidden Technique was developed specifically for people like you, who have experienced enough performative spirituality to know that there must be something deeper, more real, more transformative waiting on the other side of this compulsive pursuit. We now come to the heart of the technique that Hakwin guarded as his greatest secret for decades, teaching only to disciples who demonstrated sufficient maturity not to use this knowledge as yet another tool of the ego. The secret origin of this practice stemmed from a revolutionary discovery Hakwin himself made during a period of profound spiritual crisis. He realized that all his years of intense meditation, koan study, and ascetic practices were actually strengthening the very thing he wanted to transcend, the feeling of being someone who needs to achieve something. That's when he realized that forcing awakening is literally like trying to hold water with your open hands. The more you squeeze, the more it escapes through your fingers. The no method I'm about to reveal challenges everything our culture teaches us about achievement and progress. Instead of adding more practices, disciplines, or efforts to your spiritual life, this technique works by systematically and consciously removing everything that isn't essential to your original nature. It's like a sculptor who doesn't add anything to a block of marble, but removes everything that isn't the statue that already exists within. Hakwin discovered that our authentic soul doesn't need to be created, developed, or improved. It just needs to be discovered beneath all the layers of conditioning, identification, and compulsive seeking we accumulate throughout life. The koan of living death that Hakwin developed is perhaps the most radical and misunderstood aspect of his technique. When he spoke of dying before dying, he wasn't referring to any kind of life denial or depressive nihilism. He was pointing to the need to die psychologically, to dissolve identification with all the temporary roles, personal histories, achievements, and failures that we think define us, so that our immortal nature, which was never born and never dies, can be directly recognized. This process can happen without unnecessary drama or suffering when approached with proper preparation and correct understanding. I will now teach you the concrete practice of the 3 mirrors that form the core of Hakwin's technique. But first, you need to understand that this is not just another meditation to add to your routine. It is a systematic dissolution protocol that must be approached with deep respect and careful preparation. The first mirror is witness consciousness, developing the ability to observe your thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations without identifying with them, recognizing that you are the conscious space where all these experiences arise and pass away, not the experiences themselves. The second mirror is the breath as a bridge between the identified and the unidentified. But it's not about controlling the breath. It's about using the natural breath as an anchor to the presence that exists before any effort to breathe correctly. You simply observe how the breath happens on its own, without your interference, and use this observation to recognize all the other dimensions of your life that also happen naturally when you stop trying to obsessively control them. The third mirror is the most dangerous and was therefore reserved only for advanced disciples. The silence that dissolves the observer. At this stage, you stop being someone who is meditating and become meditation itself. Stop being someone who is breathing and become the breath. Stop being someone who is present and become a pure presence. This can be disorienting because it involves the temporary dissolution of all the reference points we normally use to orient ourselves in reality. The mistake 90% of practitioners make, even when they have access to this technique, is trying to control the awakening process instead of patiently cultivating the right conditions for it to happen naturally. It's like trying to force a flower to bloom by pulling on its petals. You might succeed in opening the flower, but it will die in the process. Authentic awakening is a natural phenomenon that emerges when obstacles are removed, not when more effort is added. Hakuin compared it to the sun always shining. We don't make the sun shine, we just remove the clouds that block its light. The alchemy of sacred boredom that Hakuin taught his closest disciples is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the entire method. In our culture of constant stimulation and instant gratification, we've learned to fear boredom as if it were a disease to be cured immediately with distractions. But Hakuin discovered that profound boredom, when not avoided but fully embraced, becomes a gateway to states of consciousness that transcend the need for constant entertainment. When you allow restlessness and impatience to be felt fully, without trying to escape them through activity, they eventually burn themselves out and reveal the vibrant silence that has always existed beneath the mental agitation. This is the purest fuel for transcendence, not the pursuit of extraordinary experiences, but the ability to find the extraordinary in the most ordinary and seemingly empty. There's something fascinating happening in neuroscience labs around the world that confirms what Zen masters have known for centuries through direct observation of consciousness. When we apply techniques like Hakuin's with consistency and precision, the brain literally reorganizes itself in measurable and lasting ways. The neurological dissolution of the fictitious self, which the ancients called ego death, can be observed through brain scans that show a significant decrease in activity in the default neural network, the circuitry responsible for the constant narration of who we are, what we want, how we compare to others, and all that mental chatter we mistake for our true identity. What's happening is a reorganization of the prefrontal cortex during genuine experiences of awakening consciousness, where areas associated with obsessive self-criticism, compulsive planning, and anxious ruminations literally quiet down, while regions linked to pure presence, natural compassion, and spontaneous creativity become more active and integrated. It's as if the brain finally stops working against itself and discovers a much more harmonious and efficient way of functioning. People who have undergone profound transformations using methods similar to Hakuin's report not only inner peace, but also clearer intelligence, more authentic relationships, and a surprising ability to handle challenges without unnecessary dramatization. But here's something few understand about why we resist awakening so much, even when we know intellectually that it would liberate us. There's an ancient fear of ego death programmed into our biology that makes us fight any experience that threatens to dissolve our familiar identity, even when that identity is the source of our suffering. Our nervous system is evolutionarily programmed to interpret ego dissolution as a threat to survival, so it activates every possible defense mechanism: anxiety, resistance, compulsive distraction, dramatization, to keep us stuck in familiar patterns, even if those patterns are limiting and painful. The chemistry of pure presence that is activated during deep meditative states reveals something extraordinary. When we stop fighting our present experience and allow it to be exactly as it is, our brain naturally produces a combination of neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, GABA, endorphins, that generate a sense of well-being independent of external circumstances. It's as if we've discovered an internal pharmacy that has always been available, but which is only activated when we stop seeking happiness in external places. This explains why advanced practitioners can maintain equanimity in situations that would devastate most people. They have developed conscious access to this natural chemistry of peace. And this brings us to the most mysterious paradox of all human consciousness. How is it scientifically and philosophically possible to be aware of consciousness itself? How can there be a dimension within you that observes your thoughts thinking, your emotions arising and disappearing, your physical sensations constantly changing, without being affected by any of these experiences? This is the dimension Hakuin called the true self, not an enhanced or evolved personal self, but the pure consciousness that has always been present as the silent backdrop of all your experiences, from the moment you were born until this very moment you are reading these words. And in a few minutes, I will teach you how to directly access this dimension using techniques that have been tested and refined through centuries of practical application in Zen monasteries. We now come to the more subtle and dangerous obstacles that keep most spiritual seekers trapped in endless cycles of searching without ever finding what they seek. These are not the obvious obstacles like laziness or lack of discipline. They are invisible traps that operate precisely through our spiritual sincerity, using our very dedication against us. The first and most devastating of these obstacles is the illusion of spiritual control, our unconscious obsession with managing, directing, and optimizing our awakening process as if it were just another project to be successfully completed. But here's the brutal truth no one wants to hear. Authentic awakening requires a level of surrender that is terrifying to the ego, because it means completely abandoning the fantasy that we can control when, how, and where our transformation will occur. When Hakuin discovered his forbidden technique, he went through a period of accepting that all his years of disciplined spiritual effort might actually have been an impediment to what he most desired to achieve. This created a profound existential crisis that nearly drove him mad, until he realized that this crisis was necessary. It was the process of psychological death that precedes any authentic rebirth. The surrender required for genuine awakening is not passive or defeatist. It is the active courage to completely let go of our agenda for how our spiritual life should unfold and trust in a greater process that our limited minds can never comprehend or control. The second invisible obstacle is even more subtle and disturbing: our unconscious attachment to our own neuroses, resisting complete healing because our identity is completely built on our problems, traumas, and limitations. There is a part of us that secretly sabotages any real progress because, unconsciously, we fear discovering who we would be if we didn't have our family dramas, our characteristic neuroses, our heroic struggles against difficult circumstances. These patterns have become so central to our self-image that healing completely seems equivalent to ceasing to exist. This is why many people undergo therapy for decades, participate in endless spiritual retreats, and accumulate profound insights, but never allow the radical transformation that would completely eliminate the need for this entire process. The trap of spiritual comparison is perhaps the most democratic of all, affecting beginners and advanced practitioners alike. We begin to measure our progress by observing other seekers, creating subtle hierarchies where we classify people as more or less evolved than ourselves. This transforms the spiritual path into yet another competitive game of the ego disguised as a search for truth. Have you ever caught yourself feeling spiritual superiority when someone demonstrates less awareness than you imagine? Or spiritual envy when you encounter someone who seems more awake? These are clear symptoms that the ego has co-opted your spiritual journey to strengthen itself through comparison, rather than dissolving through the recognition that there is no real hierarchy in consciousness. There is only consciousness recognizing itself through seemingly different forms. But there is an even more perverse obstacle that specifically affects sensitive and introspective people: the seduction of spiritual drama, where we subconsciously prefer the intensity of conscious suffering to the radical simplicity of true inner peace. There is something addictive about identifying with our own psychological depth, our capacity to feel more intensely, our refined sensitivity to subtle dimensions of experience. We can become addicted to our own emotional and spiritual complexity, preferring the familiarity of conscious anguish to the disconcerting simplicity of natural peace. The final and most devastating obstacle is the secret fear of one's own greatness, which especially haunts people who have spent years identifying with limitations, trauma, and inadequacy. Our social conditioning programs us to reject our own light, our natural ability to radiate presence and wisdom, because we've been taught that standing out spiritually is arrogant, dangerous, or socially unacceptable. Millions of people unconsciously sabotage their own awakening because they fear that others will feel threatened by their transformation, or that they themselves will be unable to integrate a more authentic and powerful version of themselves into everyday life. I will now demonstrate a concrete technique for identifying and dissolving these invisible obstacles. Close your eyes for a moment and bring to mind your greatest spiritual aspiration, not what you think you should want, but what your deepest heart truly desires in terms of inner freedom. Now notice that resistance, fears, or objections automatically arise. But if I changed so much, would it be selfish to make my family worry? What if I could no longer relate to normal people? What if I lost my motivation for work or worldly achievements? These voices are not your wisdom. They are the guardians of the ego trying to keep you stuck in familiar patterns. Hakuin's technique teaches you to listen to these voices without being overwhelmed by them, recognizing them as transient aspects of the psyche that need not define your choices. Now we come to the part of the journey that few masters discuss with complete honesty, because it's where the rubber meets the road of real transformation. How to live with expanded consciousness in the everyday world of responsibilities, relationships, and practical demands that don't magically disappear when you awaken. The challenge of ordinary life with expanded consciousness is real and can be more disorienting than the awakening process itself, because you suddenly have to navigate two realities simultaneously: the absolute dimension where everything is perfect as it is, and the relative dimension where you still have bills to pay, people to love, and practical problems to solve. Hakwin spent years developing methods to integrate these two dimensions without losing either spiritual depth or mundane functionality. He discovered that the true test of authentic awakening is not the ability to remain in heightened meditative states, but the ability to maintain connection with one's essence while washing dishes, attending work meetings, dealing with family conflicts, and facing the ordinary frustrations of human life. Enlightenment that cannot be applied to ordinary life is not enlightenment at all. It is just another temporary spiritual experience the ego can collect as a trophy. The art of being extraordinary while being completely ordinary, inspired by the Zen master Awaken, who lived in radical simplicity yet radiated a presence so profound that people traveled for days just to be in his company, reveals the central paradox of awakened life. The deeper your inner fulfillment becomes, the more natural and unpretentious your outward expression. True sages don't need to act like sages. Genuinely powerful people don't need to demonstrate power. Authentically awakened beings carry no agenda to prove their enlightenment to others. They simply live with a quality of presence that is unmistakably different, yet expressed through completely ordinary actions. Relationships after awakening present unique challenges that are rarely discussed openly. How to authentically connect with people who still live completely identified with their ego personalities, without judgment, superiority, or emotional disconnection. The temptation is to isolate oneself in spiritual communities where everyone speaks the same language. But this can become a spiritual escape that prevents true integration. Hakwin taught that relationships are the most accurate laboratory for testing the authenticity of our transformation. If our enlightenment doesn't make us more capable of unconditional love, more adept at handling conflict, more present with the suffering of others, then something is missing in our understanding. The new sense of purpose that emerges after soul awakening can be initially disorienting, because our understanding of success, fulfillment, and contribution to the world is completely transformed. Goals that once seemed crucial can lose all meaning, while activities we once considered mundane can become deeply meaningful. Some people go through periods where they can no longer be motivated by traditional goals of career, material accumulation, or social recognition, without yet having clarity about what new direction to take. This is normal and temporary. It's the realignment process where your external life gradually reorganizes to reflect your transformed inner reality. But there is also a quiet responsibility that accompanies any authentic awakening, something Hakwin called wordless dharma. The subtle duty to emanate peace and clarity through your simple presence, without preaching, teaching, or trying to convert anyone. When you truly awaken, your life automatically becomes a living teaching for others, not through what you say, but through the quality of being you manifest. People feel something different in your presence, a tranquility they can't explain, a depth that inspires them to question their own lives, an authenticity that makes them yearn for greater self-honesty. Let me show you the practical difference between someone who has consistently applied Hakwin's teachings and someone who has remained stuck in old patterns. The transformed person wakes up without anxiety about the day ahead, because they have developed deep confidence in their ability to respond appropriately to any situation that arises. They no longer need to obsessively control outcomes because they have learned to do their part with excellence and let the consequences unfold naturally. Their relationships become more honest and deeper because they are no longer afraid to be seen for who they truly are. Challenges still arise, but they face them with equanimity rather than dramatization, curiosity rather than resistance, creativity rather than habitual reactive patterns. The person who hasn't applied these teachings continues to wake up with the same underlying anxiety, trying to control people and circumstances beyond their control, repeating the same relational conflicts, reacting to the same emotional triggers, seeking external validation for an internal sense of inadequacy that is never permanently satisfied. There's no judgment here. We've all been there, but the difference in quality of life is undeniable and measurable. We have now reached the moment to integrate everything we've discovered into a final synthesis that can forever change your understanding of what it means to authentically awaken and how to safely and effectively apply Hakwin's Forbidden Technique. During our journey today, we unmask the traps of performative spirituality that keep millions of seekers trapped in cycles of knowledge accumulation without real transformation. We revealed how the modern neurosis of constant seeking contaminates even our most sincere meditative practices. We explored the secret technique of the 3 mirrors that systematically dissolves the false layers of personality until only the radiant simplicity of who you truly are remains, beneath all the masks you've learned to wear to survive in the world. We also discovered how modern neuroscience confirms what Zen masters knew through direct observation. Awakening is not a vague mystical experience, but a measurable reorganization of the brain that generates lasting changes in how we process reality, relationships, and everyday challenges. We identified the subtlest, invisible obstacles that sabotage our transformation, not just laziness or lack of discipline, but sophisticated traps like the illusion of spiritual control, unconscious attachment to one's own neuroses, and the secret fear of our own greatness that makes us reject possibilities for radical change. And finally, we come to the understanding that the true test of any awakening is not the ability to have extraordinary experiences on retreats or in meditation, but the ability to live with authentic presence amid the ordinary demands of modern life, work, relationships, practical responsibilities, without losing connection to that immortal dimension of your being that was never born and never dies. Hakwin developed his Forbidden Technique specifically for people like you, who have experienced enough of the superficial spiritual quest to know that there must be something deeper, more real, more transformative waiting to be discovered. The technique I shared today is not just another practice to add to your already overwhelmed routine. It's an invitation to radically simplify your spiritual approach, stripping away everything unnecessary until all that remains is the natural art of being present with what is, with no agenda to improve, transcend, or become someone else. When you truly grasp this, your entire life becomes a continuous practice. Not a practice you do, but a practice you are. Talking to an irritated colleague becomes an opportunity to practice mindfulness as a witness. Facing a professional challenge becomes an exercise in using the breath as a bridge to presence. Moments of boredom or restlessness become portals to discovering the vibrant silence that always exists behind the mental agitation. If you've made it this far, something within you recognizes the truth of what we're exploring, even if your logical mind still harbors resistance or doubts. This resonance is no coincidence. It's a sign that your soul is ready to awaken from the hypnosis of identification with temporary roles and remember its original nature. But remember, Hakwin's technique requires maturity, patience, and adequate preparation. Don't try to force dramatic experiences or immediate results. Cultivate the right conditions: regular stillness, brutal honesty with yourself, a willingness to question all your identifications, and allow the process to unfold at its own natural pace. And if you want to continue this journey of authentic transformation, subscribe to Axiom Sage now, because in the next videos we'll explore other Eastern masters who have developed complementary methods to the Hakwin technique, other dimensions of ancient wisdom that can accelerate your awakening in ways you can't even imagine. The community that's forming here isn't just another spiritual channel. It's a digital sanctuary for people serious about real transformation, far from the superficial promises of modern self-help. We've reached the end of this journey through Hakwin's Forbidden Technique, but in reality, you're only at the beginning of a transformation that can completely redefine your relationship with existence. It's important to be completely transparent about a reality that our culture of spiritual consumption doesn't want you to accept. Most people who have watched this video thus far will never consistently apply what they've discovered today. They'll return to their normal lives, continue accumulating insights without allowing for real transformation, and remain trapped in the same patterns of compulsive seeking that brought them here in the first place. Not out of malice or insincerity, but because it's infinitely easier to remain identified with familiar personas than to go through the process of psychological death that precedes any authentic rebirth. But you may be the rare exception who truly understands that simplicity after complexity is the most natural state of human consciousness. After studying all the methods, exploring all the techniques, experimenting with all the practices, we eventually arrive at Hakuin's no method. The natural spontaneity of the awakened soul that no longer needs to strive to be who it always was. It's like a person who spends years learning to swim with complex and technical movements, until one day discovers they can naturally float in the water without any effort. True awakening is the recognition that you never needed to become anything other than what you already are in your purest essence. And here is the final paradox that may sound disturbing to minds still stuck in the seeking mindset. When you completely stop seeking awakening, it has already happened, as Bankei taught about the nature of the unborn mind. This is not a play on words or an abstract philosophical concept. It is a literal description of how consciousness works when it stops striving to know itself. Water doesn't need to strive to be wet, fire doesn't need to try to be hot, and you don't need to work to be conscious. Consciousness is what you are, not what you have or can develop. The entire spiritual path is simply a process of removing the obstacles that prevent us from recognizing this obvious truth. The quiet responsibility that emerges when someone authentically awakens is subtle but undeniable. You automatically become a reference point for expanded human possibilities, not through words or teachings, but through the quality of presence that naturally emanates from your transformation. People feel something different when they are around someone who has genuinely awakened. A peace they can't explain, an authenticity that inspires them to question their own masks, a simplicity that makes them desire less complication in their lives. You serve the world not by trying to save it or teach it, but simply by being a living example that profound transformation is possible. The final invitation is to an extraordinary ordinary life, inspired by the irreverent Master Ikkyu, who taught through humor and total humanity. Learn to live with radical lightness, without taking either spirituality or mundane life too dramatically seriously. When you truly awaken, you discover that you can fully participate in the game of human life, working, loving, creating, resting, even suffering when necessary, without ever forgetting that it is just a game, a temporary dance of consciousness exploring itself through infinite forms. This doesn't make life less meaningful. It makes it infinitely more pleasurable because you stop resisting what is and learn to flow with what is happening. And in the end, after all the sophisticated techniques, methods, and understandings, there remains only one practice: simply being, moment to moment, with no spiritual agenda, no self-improvement project, no need to become anything other than who you are in this very moment. This is the return to the naturalness that has always been there, patiently waiting for you to stop complicating what is essentially simple. Your soul never needed to awaken. It has always been awake, silently observing all your attempts to find it. Leave a comment below, and let us know which aspect of Hakuin's technique resonated most with you today. And if you feel ready to delve deeper into this journey of authentic transformation, subscribe now, because each Axiom Sage video is a portal to dimensions of ancient wisdom that can accelerate your awakening in unimaginable ways. Your soul recognizes truth when it finds it, and it's here now, just waiting for you to stop looking elsewhere.